Okay guys, this is my sourdough starter. It's fresh out of the fridge. I've let it sit for approximately 6 hours. We can see that it is nice and broken down. Gluten matrix has fallen apart a little bit. We see lots of bubbles on top, which is indicative of yeast and bacteria activity. Originally, when I pulled it out of the fridge, it came up to about here, so it is just about doubled, which means we're about ready to refeed it to fit the next bake cycle's needs. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. What I've done now is I've added approximately 15 ounces of the starter to a bowl, knowing that I want my final volume to be over 60 ounces for this current bake. So I like to feed my starter in a 1:2:2 ratio once it's active and ready to go. So with 15 ounces of starter in the bowl, I can add approximately 30 ounces of flour and 30 ounces of water. I've mixed my 1 part starter, 2 parts flour, 2 parts water. So that's 15 ounces of starter, 30 ounces of flour, 30 ounces of water. And I've beaten it together in a bowl. Now I like to incorporate a lot of air into my starters when I'm mixing them, because I know that the yeast tend to be aerobic organisms, which means that they like oxygen to thrive. And I find that by just beating a little extra oxygen into the starter as I'm mixing it, I can actually get a much more reliable and quick rise out of my sourdough starter. So if we look here, we can see that the halfway mark is just about 1/3 up the way of the Tupperware, maybe a little less once it evens out in the corners. I'm going to actually not pay too much attention to the volume as it increases in order to determine my sourdough starter activity. I'm actually going to pay a little bit more attention at the top. If I see a lot of bubbles and a lot of activity, then I know that it's ready to go to bake with. So we'll come back as soon as the starter is ready to roll. We can see that the sourdough has risen quite a bit. If I recall correctly, when I first put it in, it was about up to here, so it's just under doubled. And if we look at the top of the sourdough, we see a lot of bubbles, indicating that there's a lot of activity in there. Again, gluten matrix is kind of broken down a little bit. We're getting real close. I'd say probably 1 more hour before this sourdough starter is ready to use. We can see that it has risen to double, maybe even a little bit more than double its original height. Additionally, we see a lot of bubbles on the surface, a lot of activity. Again, gluten matrix is nice and relaxed. And if we actually smell what's coming up off of the surface of the starter, we can smell a very strong sourdough scent. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix it in with a variety of other ingredients and essentially mix it until window pane to ensure that we develop sufficient gluten in the dough. I express all of my recipes in terms of baker's percentages, which essentially assume that flour is 100% and express each individual component thereunder as a percent of that total. So if I use 100% of flour in the case of this recipe, I would only use 94 ounces of starter, 3 ounces of salt, and 60 ounces of water. The beauty of this is it's infinitely scalable. So for example, I know that I have 72.9 ounces of starter. If I divide by 0.94, that gives me my 100% flour, which is equivalent to 76.7 ounces. Then from 76.7 ounces, I can multiply by these scalar values and get the quantities that I need for salt and water. That enables me to create the same dough every time with variable quantities of the limiting ingredient, which is most frequently starter. So if we look back at the recipe really quickly, I have measured out 100% flour, so that's 76.7 ounces of flour. I've mixed 60 ounces of bread flour with 16.7 ounces of rye flour, dark rye flour in this case, fine ground. The 72.9 ounces of starter we already have in the bowl over here, so that's already been predetermined. That's actually how we built the rest of our recipe. 3.0% salt comes out to 2.3 ounces. That 2.3 ounces has actually been added to the flour. And then the 60% water is 44.2 ounces of water, which I have in an additional container. So if we come over to the flour, we can see that I've already mixed my rye flour with my bread flour. So if I actually dig in, we can see 2 different layers of flour there. So what I'm going to do is I'm kind of just going to give it a really gentle toss. The salt is mixed in there because if you add the salt directly to the sourdough starter, it can kill both the yeast and the bacteria that we work so hard to kind of support in the starter. And the other reason that I'm mixing it by hand is because rye flour tends to clump when water is added to it, and that clumping can actually kind of result in an uneven distribution of ingredients in your final dough, which isn't good. So now that I have this all mixed together, a nice little even distribution, I'm going to go ahead and move it into the bowl. I'm going to drop that on top of the starter that's already in there. Then I'm going to come over and I'm going to take my water. I'm going to add my water in. So at this point we have all of the ingredients for the dough all together. But we don't want to necessarily just throw this right into the mixer because it'll kick up all of this loose flour that's still sitting on top. So what I like to do is I like to take my big hook and I like to just kind of mix it a couple times to get something kind of shaggy together so it's not going to kick up as much flour. You can see the starter and the water mixing with the flour here. Okay, that's probably good enough. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the dough. We're going to move it over to my Hobart A200 here. Of course, you can do this by hand if you'd like. Now that that's set in, I'm going to hook up the mixer. I'm going to get started on speed 1 just to bring it together, and then once things are really rolling and the dough is nice and homogeneous, then I'll probably kick it up to speed 2. If you don't have a mixer, you can certainly do this by hand. This dough is not very wet, so you can knead if you'd like. You can also use the stretch and fold, which there's certainly other videos available to show you how to do that. If you are going to knead, you want to make sure you knead to the same point in both cases. I am going to take this all the way to window pane, which I'll explain in a minute once it's there. And that's just kind of a way to test that there's sufficient gluten that's been developed. Of course, there are many other methods to make bread. This is just kind of how I like to make my really simple sourdough rye bread. So we're going to go ahead and get the mixer started, and we'll come back when it is ready to test for window pane. So all I've done here is I've pulled a section of dough out from the mixer. If we actually look into the mixer now, we can see that the dough is nice and together. It's definitely a smooth, homogeneous mixture at this point. We can see that there's a lot of rye in there, which is nice. But we want to test to make sure we have enough gluten. And so one way of doing that is to take a ball just out of the mixer and to gently stretch it out like this. And if you can get to the point where you can see through it without it tearing, then we know that we're at the right stage. So we can see we're almost there. So if I hold that up to the window, you can almost see through it, but it is tearing. So we're really close to developing enough gluten here. So we're going to let it go ahead and mix for another 2-3 minutes. We're going to test again, and then we're going to pull it out of the mixer. Okay, so we've tested the gluten of the dough here, and it's definitely at window pane now. So we're ready to go ahead and let it rest overnight. So I'm going to pull the dough out. And I'm just going to kind of vaguely shape it into a bowl here. And I'm just going to go ahead and set it into an oiled container. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this rest overnight, which kind of accomplishes two things. So I'm going to rest it in the refrigerator. So technically that's what we call a bulk retard of the fermentation. So we're basically retarding the fermentation to slow it down, let some of the enzymes in the flour work, and in the yeast and bacteria as well, work on some of the carbohydrates in the flour, release some different flavor compounds, but it's also kind of what they call a half-ass auto-lease. And the auto-lease method is basically technically only mixing flour and water and then resting in the fridge or out at room temp. But in our case, we have everything already mixed in here, but it's still kind of an auto-lease because the purpose of the auto-lease is in order to fully hydrate the gluten network. And when we fully hydrate the gluten network, we're kind of improving the extensibility and the final composition of the dough before we bake. So at this point, the dough is ready to go into the fridge overnight. I'm going to let it sit for approximately 24 hours. I'm going to pull it out, let it come up to room temp, let it bulk ferment for a little bit. When it has bulk fermented sufficiently, then we will turn it out onto a counter. We will pre-shape, bench, shape, proof, and bake. And we'll do that a little bit later, but for now this is going into the fridge. Okay, so it's now been about 24 hours since I put the dough in the fridge. I've gone ahead and pulled it out because I'm going to let it bulk ferment at room temperature until it's just under doubled. With an active dry yeast dough, I like to let it double completely. With a sourdough, because there's a little bit less leavening power, I like to stop it at about 1.5 times its initial volume. But if we open it up and look, we can see that overnight there hasn't been a whole lot of rising. So it's about the same volume that it was, which is good. We did indeed retard the fermentation, which means we slowed it from occurring. And what you guys can't tell over the internet, unfortunately, via video, is that the dough feels very different than it did yesterday. Now it's very extensible, so it's very smooth. Consistency is very homogeneous. It's nice and easy to work with. Obviously, the gluten network has relaxed overnight. Of course, we'll rebuild that during the shaping process. Anyway, I'm going to let this sit and bulk ferment. That'll probably take about 4 hours, given the fact that it's still very much refrigerated and needs to come up to room temperature. So the first thing that I've done, because mise en place is important, is I've pulled out all my broad forms, or banneton, whatever you want to call them, which is what I like to proof my bread in, because I feel like it adds a nice aesthetic quality as well as improves the overall proof. So I've lined them all pretty liberally with some 50% rice flour, 50% bread flour. I think the rice flour just kind of helps soak up a little bit of the water that comes out of the loaf as it proofs, so it keeps it from sticking to the banneton quite as much. And then I've just got a bunch of saran wrap laid out in big sheets to lie over the top during the proof process to keep the doughs from dehydrating. So at this point the dough has been bulk fermenting at room temperature after coming out of the fridge for approximately 4 hours. It hasn't gained a whole lot in volume because it's still a little cold, but we've seen probably maybe a 1/3 increase in the initial volume, which is good enough for me to pull it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take just a section of the dough and pull it out, set it on my worktop. I'll deal with the rest of this a little bit later. And now I'm going to kind of approximate the size that I'm going to need for these two broad forms here. So I think probably about that is good for one. And that's probably a little too much for the other. So we're going to take a piece off, toss it back into the larger container. And at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of pre-shape the bread a little bit and then let the gluten kind of relax a little. So I'm going to take this piece here, and this is a relatively high hydration dough, so it is a little sticky. I'm going to grab a little bit of flour. And I'm just going to give it a really light dusting, just around the outside to maybe loosen up just a little bit of the out. Just like that, tuck some of that flour underneath. Okay, so now that I've maybe got it loosened up from the board a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and do my pre-shape. I'm just going to tuck that in and start kind of pulling it back, tucking in the corners and pulling it back. Basically just forming a really rough loaf shape. Tuck a little bit more flour underneath and around. And the goal here is to kind of pull on the dough as you tighten, because you want to introduce some orientation to the gluten matrix on the outside of the dough. So now that we've got that settled, I'm going to pinch off the edges. And there's my really basic pre-shape. So I'm going to set that aside, let that rest just a little bit, cover it, like that, and move on to the next one here. So again, I'm just going to kind of dust a little bit with flour, loosen it from the board. And then for this one, actually, maybe for the purpose of demonstration, I'm just going to pre-shape a really light bowl. So we're going to go ahead and pre-shape a very generic bowl shape. Just turn it over. And that's going to be plenty for the pre-shape at this time. We're going to go ahead and let that rest for about 15 minutes. Well, more like 30 to 45 even. And then I'm going to come back and finalize the shape before putting them in their respective banetons. And while letting them rest, I'm going to go ahead and do that to the rest of the loaves. Okay, so the boule has rested now for about 30 minutes. It's a little bit lighter, a little bit more relaxed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of clean off a little area on my board, get it free from any of the excess flour. I'm going to take my bowl, move it over to that area, and at this point I'm just going to kind of use my hands to tighten that bowl a little bit. And I can actually go around and tighten like this. And so what I'm going to do is dust with just a little bit of flour to keep my hands from sticking, very gently, very light flour. Okay, clean off the board again so the bottom of the bowl has something to adhere to. And then we can see that it's sticking on the bottom, which will help kind of tighten our loaf. And I'm just going to work it like this. Kind of focusing on tucking the sides underneath as I work. And now what I've got is a very nice little tight bowl. Dust more liberally with flour now because it's going to go into the baneton. Go ahead and use that flour underneath. And you can actually even use your bench knife to tighten the bowl a little bit if you'd like. Take the baneton. Take my bowl. Give it one last little nice coating of flour. Make sure it's all even. Turn it upside down. Drop it into the baneton. One more little dusting of flour around the edges and top. And the bowl is ready to rest. So now we're going to do basically the same thing here with the loaf. I'm going to clean off an area. I'm going to give the loaf a little dusting. Use the bench knife to kind of apply the flour underneath. Take the dough here, and I'm just going to gently kind of shape it with my hand, tightening the gluten network. Giving it a nice roll. And again, we're going to give it a coating of flour. And I'm going to put it into its respective baneton. So I've got all the doughs shaped now. They're all sitting in their respective baneton. You know, shaping processes vary wildly between different people. I kind of just go for generic shape. I'm definitely not too much of a specialist. I enjoy eating the bread more than I enjoy shaping it. And certainly you don't have to use baneton either. You can shape freeform on top of a floured surface of some kind and just cover with a linen towel or more plastic wrap. I like to use the plastic wrap. I have them basically layered in sheets. You can see kind of a section there where two layers run over top of one another. And I like to coat them with flour because that kind of keeps them from sticking to one another. And a lot of people use trash bags from the industry. Most people kind of use cut up trash bags. I prefer to use plastic wrap because this stuff is meant to have contact with ready to eat food, and I'm a little wary of putting a trash bag directly onto my food surface. So we're ready to preheat the oven while the dough is proofing. And just to give a quick overview of my oven setup, I have a FibraMent baking stone here, which is cut basically to fit the entirety of my oven, so I have a maximum baking surface. The FibraMent is a cool material. It's actually not a flat surface. It has little ridges, and I've actually found that it greatly improves my oven spring. And then down here at the bottom, I have got an old cast iron pan that's rusting that I preheat with the rest of the oven because that's where I drop the boiling water when I put the loaves in order to generate maximum steam. So I'm going to preheat the oven to 550 degrees Fahrenheit with convection while I let the loaves proof. After the loaves have grown in size but still spring back after touching them, which should be about 2 hours, they'll be ready to bake, and I'll bake them in batches of 2 at a time. Okay, so it's been about 2 hours now since the dough has been shaped and put into the baneton for proofing. I'm just going to test to see if it's ready to proof. So if we push down, we can see that it's still rising back, which is good, but we can see that the volume has definitely increased. Additionally, over here on the stove, I've got some water that's boiling. I'm going to use that to generate the steam. So when I put the loaves into the oven, I'm going to drop some of the water into the preheated cast iron. It's going to generate steam and then we're going to roll with that. So the oven is currently set to 550 Fahrenheit with convection. So I've also got, this is what they call a super peel. The super peel is actually just a normal bread peel, but it has a linen surface that allows you to kind of operate it like a commercial conveyor belt oven, which is actually a really amazing upgrade to any home baker's kitchen. So I'm going to go ahead and take the loaf. Oh, and finally I also have a baker's lamb, which is used to slash the bread. I'm not too specific about my slashing pattern. Some people get really into it. I don't really care that much. I just like a really sharp blade in order to not make any ragged cuts on the dough. So I'm going to go ahead and take 2 loaves here. I'm going to take a normal loaf and then a boule. Keep the rest of my bread covered. So with the normal loaf, I'm just going to place my hand on the inside here and make sure it doesn't fall. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to lay it down. We can see that the panettone has left kind of a nice little flower line on the surface. So that'll be a nice little decoration. And we're going to take the boule, we're going to do the same thing here. So you want to be delicate here and make sure that you're keeping as much air in the loaf as possible. So I'm just going to take my sharp lamb and I'm going to do a really basic slashing pattern. Okay, you don't want to go too deep. You want to let it kind of open up of its own accord. And then here on the boule, I'm going to do kind of a similar thing here. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and throw these into the oven along with the steam or the hot water. So I'm going to drop my loaves into the back, and here's where that super peel comes in real handy. So I can kind of just lay it in like that. Go ahead and close my super peel, or set it aside. I'm going to pull out my cast iron pan. Get my boiling water. I'm going to drop approximately 2 cups in. We can see the steam that it's generating. It'll generate visible steam for about 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds, and then it'll continue to kind of have a very hydrated environment on the inside. The reason that we do that is to kind of slow the browning on the exterior of the loaf while we wait for the inside to cook. Additionally, it solubilizes some of the sugars on the surface of the bread and kind of creates a more homogeneous brown exterior. And then it also just kind of pre-cooks the crust. It makes it a little bit rubbery before you basically hit it with really hot, dry heat. And that just, I think, improves some of the consistencies of the crust. So I'm going to leave it at 550 Fahrenheit with convection for about 2 minutes. At the end of that 2 minutes, I'm going to go ahead and drop it down to 475 Fahrenheit. I'll rotate it 180 degrees about halfway through, and then it'll be ready to go. And wow, it already smells like great sourdough bread. Okay, we're about halfway through the bake. So let's go ahead and see what these puppies look like and do a little 180 degree turn to ensure that they're evenly baking. So we definitely have a lot of rise, still quite a bit of humidity coming out. So I'm just going to give them, like I said, a quick rotation. Purpose being that even with convection, ovens don't always bake evenly. So I want to make sure that I give them an opportunity to bake evenly. I'm going to go ahead and close that back up, and I'd say we probably have another 10 minutes left on the bake before we're ready to pull them out and let them cool. Okay guys, I think we're there. It's been another 10 minutes. The bread is looking real nice and ready. It's got a nice brown color, just the way I like it. So we're going to go ahead and pull it out of the oven. First I'll grab this bowl here. I'm going to let it rest on a wire rack. Recrank the oven back up to 550 for the remaining loaves. Get the water boiling again. Now, let's take a peek at these breads and see how they came out. So, I can tell that I didn't slash quite deep enough, because if we look, we have a little bit of bursting and that's definitely not ideal. However, crusted is nice and hard. Patterns came out nicely. See the nice swirl from the Benetton. Same issue over here on the loaf. You see a little bit of a burst, but otherwise it looks pretty good. Nice and dark. Benetton again kind of produced a nice color, or a nice swirling pattern, and definitely smells like delicious sourdough. So I'm going to go ahead and bake the rest of these loaves, and then I will cut one open to take a look at the crumb. So all the bread is out of the oven now. It's been resting for approximately 20 minutes. We can see kind of a variety of the different slash patterns. These ones didn't open up quite as I would like. I would have liked them to really open up into a big ear, but I guess the dough kind of collapsed on itself. We can see that it almost began to right here, but didn't actually finish. These were baked a little bit longer to give them kind of that glossy dark color. Same with this one over here, but overall we have 6 big beautiful loaves. All of them rose very nicely. The Benetton patterns are beautiful. They came out very strong on these loaves. And slashes really provide kind of a stark contrast to those white flower lines from the Benetton. So I think it's time to cut one open and see how it looks. So I'm going to go ahead and take this big long loaf right here. Again, it's important to really let them cool completely, or else you lose a lot of the moisture when you open them. That's a pretty beautiful crumb. Lots of big air inclusions. Nice rubbery crust from the relatively high hydration dough. Although I guess it was really only 60%, not including the starter. And let's see how it tastes. Nice crisp crust. Good sour flavor. It's a good bread. Delicious. Thanks for watching.